This incredibly unhealthy obsession with these groups is what the entire K-pop fandom is all about. They proudly call themselves stans, and for those that don't know, stan is a term coined from Eminem's song Stan. It's a combination of stalker and fan. I don't know why anyone would make this their entire identity. These K-pop stans have changed their entire life to make it all about being a fan of that group. A group that has no connection to them. The group doesn't know they exist, and if the group ever encountered that person in the real world, they would immediately call security because they'd be afraid. It's disturbing to have a complete stranger know everything about you.
So it's fair to say lots of different Korean media has really been taking over Western audiences over the last 10 years. Of course, recently, Squid Game has been the big one, but of course, before you have a lot of Korean cinema that has become very, very famous. Parasite, of course, being one of the more famous films. Recently, funnily enough, both of these things actually have an anti-capitalist message as well. Owing to South Korea's own form of capitalism that is particularly brutal in terms of the debt a lot of people rack up. And that is like a nice lead on to today's topic, where we're going to be talking about K-pop, but also mainly K-pop stans, people who are massive fans of the biggest K-pop groups, mainly like the girl groups and the boy band groups, but have become like their own like political entity online, because many of you may have got into arguments on Twitter with people whose profile pictures are just a random band member from one of these Korean K-pop bands. It actually reminds me a lot of football Twitter and for you Americans, soccer Twitter, where you have all these different Twitter users who are basically anonymous because their profile pictures are just their favorite footballer. Maybe that is like a video for another time. I don't know how much my audience actually cares about football, but it is interesting, like the political dynamics on there that are often reflections of either a football Twitter user's nationality or the club they support. So with the K-pop stuff today, what we're going to be talking about is like the duality of K-pop stans, the good activism they have done, the bad activism they have done, and just how like this has become such a phenomenon. But I also want to tie it into like the recent debt themes in Korean like media that's been touched in the West, like Squid Game and Parasite, and talk about Psy's Gagnam Style, because of course, even though that is like quite a fun song, it seems quite just like typical pop on the surface. It did actually have like this kind of subversive message. And Psy actually has a history of being controversial in like opposing US military bases in Korea. So we're going to talk about all of that today. Now, before we go any further, you guys often say you don't like the video unless I tell you. So if you do like the video, remember to like the video on YouTube. Also, maybe subscribe to the channel and maybe leave a comment. Any engagement helps this video get to other people. Also, if you want to support my work going forward, please consider becoming a patron. Like I always say, I want to have as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, the benefits of which are getting my Nintendo Switch friend code and access to the private patrons Discord server. Also, if you want to follow me on social media, please follow me on Instagram and on Twitter, both at the Kavernacle, and also come join our communities on my subreddit and on my Discord, and of course also follow my personal Reddit. All of that stuff will be in the pinned comment and in the description. So I said I wanted to talk about Psy and Gagnam Style to start with, because for many of us, especially people who are about my age, who are teenagers in the early 2010s, Gagnam Style was this absolute phenomenon coming out of South Korea. For many of us, it was our first exposure to Korean media at all. I know especially for me it was. And it was kind of weird for a lot of us. It's like, look how popular this song has become, and we like literally do not understand the lyrics. For a lot of us, especially as young people, we didn't know much about South Korea beyond the Korean War, and obviously that's called the Forgotten War for a reason, because many people really don't know much about the Korean War anyway. Now, a lot of Westerners, especially Americans, somehow think all Japanese people and all Korean people love US military bases in their country because they either like protect them from North Korea and China, or in the case of South Korea, the US saved South Korea in the Korean War and they're there to protect them from the war that is technically still ongoing. If you get into a bit of nuance, loads of people in Korea and Japan absolutely hate the US military presence, and Psy was no different, and he actually got into a lot of trouble after he became like world famous because of previous comments about the American bases there. So just going to go into the drama and talk about what he says quick. So Psy apologizes for anti-American performances. I will forever be sorry for any pain I've caused anyone by those words. Gangnam Style singer Psy issued an apology Friday in response to widespread reports about his participation in 2 anti-American concerts a decade ago in South Korea. According to reports in Korean media, in 2002, Psy smashed a model of a US tank into the stage at a concert in protest of a tragic incident that occurred in June of that year when a US military vehicle ran over 2 14-year-old Korean girls. The driver of the vehicle was later acquitted, leading to months of protests against the American government. 2 years later, Psy joined other artists on stage at a protest concert to perform the song Dear America, written by the South Korean metal band Next. Sounds very, very based. Psy sang along to the lyrics, "Kill those Yankees who have been torturing Iraqi captives. Kill those Yankees who ordered them to torture, kill their daughters, mothers, daughters-in-laws, and fathers. Kill them slowly and painfully." Okay, maybe that last bit is going a bit extreme, but you can tell, like, with these events happening at the same time, many people in Korea really hated the American government, especially under George Bush and his foreign policy. Obviously, if you listen to any metal, lyrics like that aren't really surprising, but it's maybe a bit surprising that Psy sung along with them. But he responded to this and said, "As a proud South Korean who was educated in the US and lived there for part of my life, I understand sacrifices American servicemen and women have made to protect freedom and democracy in my country and around the world. The song from 8 years ago was part of a deeply emotional reaction to the war in Iraq and the killing of 2 innocent Korean civilians that was part of the overall anti-war sentiment shared by others around the world. While I'm grateful for the freedom to express oneself, I've learned there are limits to what language is appropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for how these lyrics could be interpreted. I will forever be sorry for any pain I've caused anyone by those words." So I maybe understand apologizing for singing along with the metal band. Obviously, the bit about Americans protecting freedom and democracy around the world, he was probably made to say by his management team to appeal to Americans, because I think he was about to perform at some sort of event for Obama just before these comments were made, like, widely available. But it does show you, like, a nice insight into how many Koreans feel about the US presence there, and while many Americans think they're doing them a favor, a lot of Koreans and Japanese feel like they're just exacerbating the tensions there. Like, I made a video about the Japanese Communist Party about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and one of their key policies is getting rid of all US military bases, especially the one on Okinawa. But Gangnam Style, the song that Psy obviously sung himself, isn't without its political nuance as well. So I want to talk about this first, to talk about why some K-pop stans might actually lean left, because there's a lot of controversy about them being like right-wingers and bigoted and things like that. But with someone so influential in the genre going really mainstream around the world, I'm just trying to paint the picture that it's not surprising that many people into this stuff might be left-leaning as well. So an article by Max Fisher, Gagnam Style dissected the subversive message within South Korea's music video sensation. Park Jae-sang is an unlikely poster boy for South Korea's youth-obsessed, highly lucrative and famously raucous pop music. Park, who performs as Psy, is relatively ancient at 34 and has been busted for avoiding the country's mandatory military service. I like this guy the more I read about him, and is not particularly good looking. His first album got him fined for inappropriate content, and the second was banned. He's mainstream in the way that South Korea's monolithically corporate media demands of its stars, who typically appear regularly on TV variety and even game shows, but as a harlequin, a performer known for his parodies, outrageous costumes, and jokey concerts. Still, there's a long history of fools and court jesters as society's most cutting social critics, and he might be one of them. Gagnam is a Tony Seoul neighborhood, and Park's Gangnam Style video lampoons its self-importance and ostentatious wealth, while Psy playing a clownish caricature of a Gagnam man. That alone makes it practically operatic compared to most K-pop, but I spoke with 2 regular observers of Korean culture to find out what I was missing, and it turns out that the video is rich with subtle references that, along with the song itself, suggest a subtext with a surprisingly subversive message about class and wealth in contemporary Korean society. That message would be awfully marred by American standards. This is no born in the USA, but South Korea is a very different place, and it's a big deal that even this gentle social satire is breaking records on Korean pop charts long dominated by cotton candy. So talking about South Korea's sky-high credit card debt rate, which is something that, of course, Squid Game touched on a lot. In 2010, the average household carried credit card debt worth a staggering 155% of their disposable income. There are nearly 5 credit cards for every adult. South Koreans have been living on credit since the mid-1990s, First, because their country's amazing growth made borrowing seem safe, and then in the late 1990s when the government encouraged private spending to climb out of the Asian financial crisis. The emphasis on heavy spending, coupled with the country's truly astounding two-generation growth from agrarian poverty to economic powerhouse, have engendered the country with an emphasis on hard work and aspirationalism, as well as the materialism that can sometimes follow. So Adrian Hong, a Korean-American consultant whose wide travels make him an oft-quoted observer of Korean issues, said that Gagnam is a symbol of that aspect of South Korean culture. The neighborhood is home of some of the South Korea's biggest brands, as well as $84 billion of its wealth. As of 2010, that's 7% of its entire GDP in the area of just 15 square miles, a place of the most conspicuous consumption. You might call it the embodiment of South Korea's 1%. The neighborhood in Gagnam is not just a nice town or a nice neighborhood. The kids that he's talking about are not Silicon Valley self-made millionaires. They're overwhelmingly trust fund babies and princeling, he explained. The video is a satire about Gagnam itself, but also about how people outside Gagnam pursued their dreams to become one of those Gagnam residents without even realizing it. Koreans have been kind of caught up in this spending to look wealthy, and Gagnam has really been the leading edge of that, Hong said. I think a lot of what Sai is pointing out is how silly that is. The whole video is about him thinking he's a hotshot, but then he's realizing he's just, at a children's playground, or thinking he's playing polo or something and realizing he's on a merry-go-round. I think it all ties back to the same thing. The pursuit of materialism, the pursuit of form over function. Koreans made extraordinary gains as a country in terms of GDP and everything else, but that growth has not been equitable. I think the young people are finally realizing that there's a genuine backlash. You're seeing a huge amount of resentment from youth about their economic circumstances. So like the article was saying at the start, there are plenty of subversive music groups throughout the whole of the world, and what he was saying in this particular video wasn't anything revolutionary, but in an industry, which we'll talk about a bit later, that is so manufactured by giant corporations in Korea in a really, really dystopian way, it's quite big that a song satirizing some of the most wealthy people in Korea in the sort of context of their massive debt crisis does so well throughout the world. Anyway, I thought the Gagnam stuff was interesting. I thought Psy and his politics are very, very interesting, especially the protests against the US government. But I'm just laying the foundations of why some people who make consumers media might be fairly left-wing. Now, I want to go to K-pop stans, the good and the bad, before moving on to how dystopian and capitalist the K-pop industry is. So like I said earlier, a lot of you guys may have experienced K-pop fans. If you type in K-pop stans, K-pop fans into YouTube, there are loads of YouTubers who've made videos talking about how crazy these people are, how zealous these people are. There is some truth to that stuff, because a lot of these fans are very, very zealous in protecting the band they like most and fighting within K-pop stan communities about who's the best, who's sold the most, everything like that. That's why I say it reminds me a lot of football Twitter, because football Twitter are always arguing about who's won the most trophies. You say Man United are bad, the team I support, then I'll just pull out all the trophies they won, how they're the most successful team in England. And then if you're a Man City fan, you'll just point out who's won the most trophies in the last 10 years or something. But K-pop stans have kind of taken that to another level. So now I want to talk about the good of K-pop stans and some of the political activism they've done before talking about the bad and the harassment they have often engaged in. K-pop stans is such a broad thing. There are many different groups within them who support different artists, but obviously it's not a monolith. Loads of just average people from around the world join these communities because they like the music specifically and first and foremost. Some just take it to another level, and some often take it way too far. So if you guys remember this in 2020, a good article by Kathleen Ho lays this all out. So this radicalization, I don't know if I would use the specific word of being radicalized, but of the stans seems to have begun on May 31st when the Dallas Police Department tweeted a request for users to submit videos of illegal protest activity on Twitter on their own iWatch app. Download the app and send in all your fan cams, one user suggested per BuzzFeed News. Fan cams are short videos of K-pop stars performing that stans are notorious for posting replies to mostly unrelated tweets. Send them all, make their jobs as hard as possible, get them frustrated, make them take down the app. And of course, this was during the Black Lives Matter protest back in 2020. So the response was immediate. Hundreds of people responded to the Dallas PD tweet or posted screenshots of themselves spamming the app. "Oh, I have a video, I hope this helped," one user says. They tweeted along with the footage of Onius flawlessly executing crisp dance moves to level up while wearing perfect guy liner. Within 24 hours, the app was out of commission. Dallas's police department tweeted the next day, "Due to technical difficulties, iWatch Dallas app will be down temporarily." With their power unleashed, the stands turned their attention elsewhere. They mobilized against police departments in Kirkland, Washington, and the Great Rapids, Michigan, which had similarly asked users to post photos and videos of protesters. And by Wednesday, June 3rd, they had completely overwhelmed the White Lives Matter hashtag, started in opposition to the BLM movement with a deluge of impeccably dancing idols, effectively burying its messaging. Instead of being racist, become an NCTzen and stream punch, a representative tweeted from a fan of the group NCT. "K-pop fans are from all different races, so we try and support each other," said user at Pinks for Blinks, a Blink fan of Blackpink. "When we found out White Lives Matter was trending, we came together to drown out all the bad things. I've never been so proud to be a K-pop fan." So this helps that a lot of K-pop idols have been speaking up about Black Lives Matter, so they've become more vocal in speaking out against social justice issues. 22 of them took to social media to support the prosecution of Korea's Nth Room case, a scandal involving exploitation of girls. A number of them, including BTS, CL, J-Pop, Tiger JK, Tiffany Young, and Momoland, also supported BLM on their platforms. As such, the stands feel that idols would approve of how they're using their own platforms. Even though stan Twitter can come across with its downsides, we tend to touch on serious matters like these if needed. Activism and using your platform to spread awareness isn't new in K-pop stan Twitter. So another article talking about the complexity of this stuff, the complicated history of K-pop activism by NK Agbor, and it says here, "The K-pop community is not without its flaws. Despite the K-pop community's recent work in the BLM movement, Tiwa, a K-pop fan and writer who goes by the Twitter handle Queen Tiwa, says, we see that way in the harassment, doxing, attacks, stalking, and so much that takes place within these online communities. I've previously written about this where black K-pop fans share their horror stories of what it's like being a K-pop fan and the backlash they constantly receive to the point where someone needed to notify the FBI about the threats they were receiving. As many black K-pop fans know, the fandom is a hub for anti-blackness. Many fans come from cultures with deep connections to anti-blackness. When K-pop acts appropriate black culture, they do so because it's viewed as a trend. Black culture doesn't necessarily have the traceable historical legacies of other cultures. The hypocrisy of stans advocating for black lives, yet terrorizing black lives within their fandom shows the shortcomings of their activism. So obviously the bigotry within the community is like not unique to them, but it does seem like hypocritical in some instances that while they're doing good work for Black Lives Matter, they're also like harassing black members of the K-pop community. But then there was another instance of K-pop stans giving awful bigoted harassment as well. So in October 2020, Kiwi, which is, for people who don't know, someone from New Zealand, choreographer, receives threats and abuse from K-pop fans. Keel Tutin, who is based in Auckland, became a worldwide trending topic on Twitter after the fans of the South Korean girl group Blackpink trolled him for choreographing the group's new single, Lovesick Girls. In an emotional Instagram post, the 24-year-old said he opened Twitter on Saturday to discover 25,000 faceless accounts telling me to die. I opened Twitter to see thousands and thousands of messages saying that the choreography sucks. Crazy to me that there's so many people that think this is okay and putting that much negativity out online. He also said it was ironic given that he only choreographed a small part of the routine, with the group's Korean record label handling the rest. Only 20% was used, which we've grown to accept with these K-pop companies because they contact multiple choreographers and they have people in-house that change it and make their own decisions about what the artist should be doing. Gill also added that K-pop fans need to stop treating the artists like gods and sending hate and negativity to their collaborators. I just don't think it's wise putting people on such a high pedestal and then pushing down everyone around them. That's not the way to succeed. So I don't believe Blackpink are bigoted or prejudiced in any way, and it's a shame that a large portion of their fan base are defaming them in such a manner. I don't want to discredit the millions of K-pop or Blackpink fans who conduct themselves in a civilized manner, but if you mention K-pop stans to anyone who frequents Twitter, they'll shudder. I decided to post a fraction of the disgusting comments I received in an attempt to bring awareness to the horrendous filth many innocent people endure on a daily basis. I'm an out, visibly queer person with experience in television, with not-for-profit organisations, and I've been on social media for over a decade. I have a thick skin, I can take it, I just fear for those who can't. So I used the word zealous earlier, and I think that's the perfect way to describe K-pop stans, no matter which way you look at it. In one way, they're doing really good things and overwhelming American police departments like calls for footage of protesters who are protesting for Black Lives Matter and then organising around social issues like that. But then others, and thousands of them, are also harassing people with absolutely insane harassment. And sadly, this isn't like a one-off, because this is the reputation K-pop stans have gotten for themselves, for right or wrong, because the amount of harassment they often direct at people, especially people who possibly critique their favorite creators or critique the industry, is just really, really toxic. And of course, it's unnecessary. And it's something you don't really see from fans of other artists. Like, you don't get like American indie rock fans acting like this. You don't even get like football Reddit acting like this a lot of times. So this is a left-wing anti-capitalist YouTube channel. So if I'm doing a video about K-pop, I have to talk about the like dystopian nature of its industry and like the for-profit nature of its industry. And despite many of the most prominent K-pop artists being pretty good on social issues generally, and obviously people like Psy being like anti-US imperialism when he was younger and stuff like that, massive increase in this stuff's popularity obviously have so many more people in Korea wanting to get into this industry and become the next like megastar. And obviously with Gangnam Style criticizing this sort of materialistic culture back like 10 years ago, obviously the debt stuff in Korea has only got worse. So in the Squid Game, you saw people all competing to get to the top of this game because they were so overwhelmed with debt. I bet there are situations where their parents push their children into becoming K-pop artists and going to these boot camps so they themselves can become rich and get out of debt themselves. There are lots of parallels of football, and in my mind I'm thinking about adults who set up social media accounts for their football playing children to market them to big football clubs. Because in the UK, unlike the US, for example, if you play for a professional Premier League club when you're younger, you do get paid. And of course, the prospect of getting paid loads of money are there. So strangely, I couldn't actually find lots of stuff on K-pop and capitalism. You'd think there'd be like a lot of work done on this, but there isn't. A lot of Medium blogs done on this and a lot of good YouTube videos, but I was reading this really good article from something called Economica ID, which seems to be an Indonesian student newspaper, but I think the points it makes are really, really good. So I'm going to read some for you by Mohammed Dafa Nuzfazan and Erica Nujaya. So talking about like how this all works. So before entering K-pop bootcamp, young Korean children must sign a contract that lists terms and conditions during and after training. The contract specifies training duration, profit sharing percentages, and the amount that idols must repay to the agency to break even with respect to training costs. Further, the contract contains little to no freedom of activity for individual idols for a long period of time, ranging from 7 to 13 years. These contracts are designed in a way to operate the machine that will bring cash cows idols to the agencies. Long and tiresome training, unhealthy diet programs, forced plastic surgery, controlled identities are the initial components necessary in completing the final product. These restrictions are some of the main reasons these arrangements are called slave contracts, as the idol wannabes sacrifice a significant portion of freedom. The term was first used in relation to SM Entertainment's in 2004 contract with their boy band TVXQ, which jump-started the industry. Its success inspired other big management companies and agencies to adopt similar contracts. It is clear that an idol's career heavily depends on their management or agency. In order to preserve its success, the agency maintains significant control over their talent. The industry, run by agencies, is responsible for all aspects of shaping the global image of K-pop, including the idol's private behavior, dating life, and public conduct. Another root cause of K-pop being this way is how music is perceived differently. In the Western world, music is generally viewed as a hobby to complete on your leisure time. 2 centuries after the Industrial Revolution has generated less working hours, more leisure time. Don't know how true that is for a lot of people. The excess of leisure time then drives more people to invest in hobbies such as music, and it became a profession. Although the music industry generates considerable revenues, countries of the West have arguably not been able to obtain full control over the production process, thus generating the complexity and fluidity of diverse music genres as we have today. The case is different in Korea. In markets, there are of course winners and losers, and the winners in the music industry then become what we call popular music. Popular music then becomes systemized in melody and harmony, so there are little to no differences between different artists at all during a particular period. There are little variations between the K-pop music styles, as they are all being produced systemically with one particular direction. In the West, music companies don't inherently participate directly in the music creation of the artist's visual representation, but only as its record label. Each artist has their own producer, composer, and songwriter to help create the final product. This is clearly antithetical to South Korean agencies partaking in full control of music creation, record label, and the visual representation of each idol, so the final product is exclusively manufactured by companies instead of being freely created by individuals. The spark of K-pop success has brought the Korean economy into a whole new level. BTS, one of the major boy groups, has brought nearly $5 billion into the national GDP. This may seem minuscule compared to other industries such as technology and manufacturing, but the most tremendous impact of K-pop and the Korean wave was on visualizing the South Korean image globally. However, a problem arises in the market that leads to negative effects in and beyond in the market. The harsh working conditions and limited freedom of expression has taken South Korean boys and girls into a cage of a dystopian loop that turns them into no more than dolls. Every second, every minute, every hour, every day, they must maintain their supposedly godlike image between citizens, and a single wrong step will drown them deeper into alienation and mental distress caused by society. These conditions have notoriously driven some idols into deep depression. Being a K-pop star may be a pipe dream for many people, particularly young Koreans. Its fame and glamour has attracted a lot of people to become one and to look like one, living under an unliving homestead, honing their vocal and dance skills for their entire life, sleeping under irregular hours, engaging in unhealthy diet programs become their normal lifestyle for 7 to 13 years. Being an idol will snatch enjoyment of regular life as long as the slave contract stands, not to mention the accumulated costs needed to perfect your facial shape and retain your beauty in order to meet the requirements. So before I just talk about the article a bit more, I went on K-pop thoughts and typed in capitalism to see if these K-pop stands often talk about capitalism. So someone wrote, anti-capitalist K-pop stands, how are we holding up? For an industry that is so ridiculously capitalist, I've seen a lot of fans who are left leaning on an economic scale. How are y'all dealing with the companies capitalizing on our emotions? The trick is plain as day, the hyper immersion into the daily lives of idols that make us fall in love with them, and the constant waves of content keeps us interested, so we continue to support our fave groups, even if the company screws them over for money because they personally didn't do anything wrong. I'm just interested in how you rationalize this cognitive dissonance. Someone saying, I try to remember it's a show business, emphasis on the business. I don't quite know how to rationalize the fact that 2 of the biggest songs by one of my favorite bands are literally about capitalism. I guess being aware of the current labour issues within the industry and keeping a critical eye, like you said, are 2 things we can do. It's tough. The industry is messed up in a lot of ways, but I try to focus on the individuals who have a passion and just want to express it within this imperfect system. I don't buy a ton of stuff, mainly just the occasional physical album. I spent money in the Superstar games, but I decided a few months ago that I'm never doing that again. I don't buy anything just because an idol has endorsed it. I honestly don't even know what they endorse because I have zero desire to feed into that side of the industry. That has nothing to do with music. If the idols speak out against the industry's hyper-capitalist approach, I would support them, although my support wouldn't mean much. So the way K-pop operates really reminds me of Hollywood between like the 1930s and like 1970s, where talent would often sign these massive contracts that would essentially bind you to one studio. But even then, they would not have as much control over your life, mainly just your job. Where K-pop is extremely dystopian, where you sign away your life, basically. Like they say, it's a slave contract. They pressure you to get cosmetic surgery to look a certain way. They obviously have synthesized this product where, like this article was outlining, there isn't as much room for actually artistic expression because under capitalism, like with the film industry right now, and even TV to a lesser extent, you are seeing what is happening with like Marvel films. There is a certain formula, you have to tick a certain box and you have to stay within this formula to make as much money as possible. And while people like love Marvel films, like people love K-pop, you can't deny that cinema in terms of this stuff is being put into a little box like K-pop is, because that's what studios know, just like with K-pop, will make them the most money. It's not surprising that most films every year for the last like 6, 7, 8 years have all been superhero movies, often only owned by Disney, Marvel, sometimes owned by other companies as well, but they are all insanely similar. And even the ones that are a bit more different, like, you know, Thor Ragnarok, is still confined by audience expectations and the narrative design that the studio expects to make them generate as much money as possible. Like, we're not getting Marvel movies made by David Lynch and Terrence Malick anytime soon. And even if they did do a Marvel movie, they wouldn't be allowed to have, you know, their artistic vision. Absolutely. I mean, look what they did with Chloe Zhao. They took someone who directed Nomadland, which I didn't really like, but it is pretty unique, and then made them direct The Eternals, which is like one of the most generic Marvel films. You can't tell me that she wanted to make that exact movie. And that's what K-pop is doing right now, but the different part is they have this dystopian control over your entire life. So even if you make it like a lot of them do, they still spiral into deep depressions. But just as I was reading that article, I had a thought that this stuff is designed to create K-pop stans, because like some of those people were saying on the Reddit, you get to look into every part of their life, but every part of their life is very manufactured to make you like them as much as possible. So no wonder they have such zealous fans willing to defend everything about them, because they feel like they know them, when in reality they're being manipulated so they'll spend as much money as possible on these corporate music products. So anyway, that is it for the video. I found this very interesting and fun to talk about, surprisingly. We covered a lot of stuff, but let me know in the comments, are you a K-pop fan? What do you think of this video? What do you think of the industry? And like, you know, what do you think of Stan Twitter? If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Support my channel on Patreon. If you want to join our communities, check out the Discord and the subreddit. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.